that's better. So, hi everyone. Thanks for making it back so early. I personally had a few beers last night, so it's going to be challenging to give talks, but still. So today I get to follow the Maurice and Itai after they gave excellent talks, and they came at everything from I guess the distributed algorithms side and try to reconcile blockchain with the existing theory, right? If there was one motif to the talks, I'm actually my background is different, so I'm going to come at it from a different direction. I'm going to start close to the Bitcoin protocol. I want to talk for the first hour about the scalability problem and really get down to where Bitcoin starts to fail. And it's going to start very trivial. We're going to talk about like very benign things like storing the entire blockchain and so on. And I hope we're going to get to less and less trivial stuff through the hour. And then the second hour, I want to try and take you in a more interesting direction, which has been my research focus or at least some of my research has been spent on it for the past couple of years, which is looking at DAG protocols and seeing if they can help this scalability problem. So the place to start, I think, is maybe in the debate that kind of erupted in Bitcoin. I think it was already maybe 2-3 years ago. Maybe the roots started somewhere in 2014. I remember being at a conference and Gavin Andresen was walking around asking, do you think we should increase the block size in Bitcoin by a factor of 2? This sounds like where all we have to do is change one parameter in the protocol, and that sounded like a benign question. I gave him my opinion. Other people had different opinions. It was very civilized at the beginning. And like any other discussion that goes online on the internet, it quickly turned ugly. And it turns out that this parameter of a block size was extremely contentious. Bitcoin eventually split into Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. Recently, Bitcoin Cash also split over such discussions on where to take the protocol. There was a lot of tension between the miners, right? These groups, these few large groups who have some interest in the protocol, who wanted to pull it one way. And there was if you don't know this hack, the acronym here is for user activated soft fork. People started saying we are going to fork the protocol without the miner's consent. We don't care. We'll just ignore. We're going to run nodes that ignore their blockchain if they don't change the rules. And this sparked a whole debate about where is the actual power, the economic power, who holds control of the protocol. Is it really the miners who validate the blocks, or is it the users who even recognize their blockchain as being legitimate? And I think this shifted the debate. It's a very interesting thing to follow. I mean, even sociologists, I think, are looking at this community, some that I know, and find this fascinating.
Should be an issue. This was already mentioned before. If the blockchain is too big, it will show the system. Why?
So this is what I'm going to talk about for the whole hour. So I'm going to give you like every different angle of why Bitcoin is going to suffer or not if we try to scale. So first, I'm going to have to start with the mandatory slide on the double spend attack, because this is the basis for most of the most of the debate, right? So you see your transaction, right? Let's say I'm the blue guy. I get some money from Mr. Red, and it's in the blockchain. It's already deep inside. And really the thing that I'm worried about that's going to happen is that suddenly someone's going to show up with a longer chain, and the red guy turns out to be a fraudster. He actually also assigned the money that he was supposed to pay me to some other address. Maybe it's his other account or his friend or another storekeeper. And I already gave him a product in exchange for the money that he just paid me. And now this is the longest chain, and I'm stuck without any money. This never happened. And this is the only event that took place in our log of events, right? The ledger has a payment going to green instead of me. So the thing that protects us from this is the proof of work that it's really hard to create this long chain unassisted. And in some sense, you're racing against the honest nodes as they go along, right? So this picture has already some assumption hidden in it. and can you tell what the assumption is? What's the assumption that is most relevant to scalability that happens here, right? So this picture, why is this idealized? So the assumption, right, they're really, if you read Satoshi's paper and you try to extract the theorem from it, so he did have some result. It wasn't exactly correct. Later it was fixed by other people. Manny Rosenfeld, that you saw at the meetup last night, was the first person who actually analyzed this as a random walk. And then the assumptions here are, first of all, one that we already know, that the attacker has to control less than 50% of the compute power for us to be safe from double spend attacks. The other assumption is that this is a chain and not something that is built in parallel, right? So this is created by different actors. So if we draw this as a chain and not some other tree, this already assumes that people can send blocks to each other really quickly. When I send a block, it instantly arrives at all other nodes, and the next block that the honest nodes in the network will build will be right on top of that. That's the assumption, underlying assumption in the analysis, which is ridiculous if you think about it, because you were analyzing a distributed protocol that's built to get consensus when we don't have instant transmission, and we do the security analysis in this world where everybody instantly broadcasts to everyone, right? That's a little bit ridiculous. So you assume here that nodes can really send quickly, and then what you get as a result is that the probability that this block will be ever replaced decreases exponentially with the number of blocks that are built on top of it. That's the result if you can kind of summarize it. So that underlying assumption is one that we're going to start to talk about. But maybe we should still talk about what it means to scale. And I think it's interesting to look at it at a historical perspective. So this is Bitcoin from its creation in 2009. What you see in the y-axis is the number of daily transactions that are done with the protocol. And it's been slowly increasing over time. This is the spike that kind of corresponds with Bitcoin hitting $20,000. So there was a lot of activity on the protocol. And even now that the price is low, you can see there's still a fair number of transactions taking place on the blockchain. What's not in the picture here is really that there is some sort of a glass ceiling here that you cannot cross. Because Bitcoin's block size is restricted, right? It used to be restricted to 1 megabyte. Now there is you should put an asterisk next to that. There was a protocol fix that's called SegWit that allowed us to do slightly larger blocks. But let's consider a 1 megabyte block just for ease of discussion. So if you have 1 megabyte to write transactions in, and you have one block every 10 minutes, that already gives you a limit. And the limit, of course, is artificial. Why did we pick 10 minutes? Why did we pick 1 megabyte? And this is exactly what I want to talk about. What if we just naively change these parameters? So the result here, the way you see that this is the ceiling, is best shown if you look at the fees, transaction fees that were charged. This is a really nice website that looks at the mempool, the queue of transactions that are waiting to get through the protocol. And what you see here is the number of megabytes in the mempool at different dates. This is January of 2017, I think. January 2018, when we were hitting the peak of $20,000. And these different colors are transactions that are basically offering different fees. So the more you are towards the red, the higher the fees that you're offering. So these turn out to be something like on the order of 200, 300 Satoshis per byte. So transactions actually pay per byte that they're going to put into the blockchain. And the reason is we have this restricted space in blocks. So we sell it at a premium. If you're a larger transaction, you're going to have to offer more money. So the right way to think about how much you should pay is actually per byte, right? So long transactions need to pay more, but you also increase your price per byte to get in faster. And what you're seeing here is basically 350 megabytes of backlog that happened, right, when the prices hit, right, the price of Bitcoin hit the peak of $20,000. And basically, this means we have a backlog of something like 350 blocks that doesn't get cleared for the span of several months. Okay, so if you were trying to send a transaction with a low fee, that never gets processed. Only these red ones and yellows maybe do. And eventually, the mempool did recover when activity in Bitcoin subsided. It took quite a while to clear the backlog. So, right, if you look at this, like from in a kind of tighter time frame, you'll see this jagged pattern. These are transactions being added. You go up, and every time a block is closed, there's like a drop down in the mempool when something is cleared in a chunk. And then it goes up, and another block is found, and so on. So this is what you see here is roughly an hour, and blocks were created actually faster than once every 10 minutes because people were mining like crazy when the price of Bitcoin is $20,000. So you do see a block rate kind of appear here. And the state today is that the mempool is basically empty. It still clears. The fees are much lower. You see that the colors are in the blues, and transactions are cheap. Right, so that's maybe the basic facts. And now, what you'd really want to do with Bitcoin is compare it to other payment systems, and the orders of magnitude that we want to get to. I mean, Visa is always quoted as something like having 2,000 transactions per second worldwide, and these are numbers that are pretty old. I think they're around 2010. Visa needs to handle more transactions per second at peak times. So the peak for Visa is actually coming up. It's right the day before Christmas. Everybody forgot to buy their presents. So if they look at the highest number of transactions per second, that happens on that day. And that's what they say. They always stress test the system in the summer, preparing for Christmas. So they actually probably by now they report being able to do 26,000 transactions per second or something like that. On the other hand, PayPal does several hundred transactions per second, and Bitcoin at current rates is around 3. That's like orders of magnitude that you want to aspire to. Yeah.
Just a question about the previous slides. So does this mean that some transactions took weeks to
Yes. So it was very frustrating if you think about it for a second. Let's say you send a transaction with a low fee, and it's there, it's in the queue, maybe here by accident. And now you try to send another transaction. The miners don't necessarily take your newer one over the older one. They need to understand that will they replace your old transaction in the mempool? So Bitcoin is doing all sorts of weird things with transaction clearing. Maybe if you have a transaction that spends your transaction that's in the queue, and that one adds a very high fee on top of that, right? Together, they might be worth it for a miner. Does the miner understand that? Is there software that detects this? This is something called a child pays for parent. A child transaction adding more money to get the parent to clear. So your money isn't stuck. So this actually happened to a student of mine, Jonathan Sompolinsky. He was too cheap to send to actually pay fees for some transaction. We actually got a tip on a Reddit tip bot because we talked about our paper or something. Somebody sent us $10. So Jonathan wanted to send it. He gave a 0-fee transaction, which was a mistake. He waited, I think, a couple of weeks. It wasn't at the peak here. It was some other time, but he still had to wait 2 weeks to get the money to move. The wallet wouldn't agree to send it again with a higher fee. The wallets weren't built to do that at the time. So this is kind of part of the awkwardness of dealing with Bitcoin. You actually have wallet software that tries to estimate these fees, how much you should pay. And if the wallet software doesn't do a good job, and most wallets do a very poor job of estimating fees, your transaction is stuck. So if you ask why Bitcoin adoption isn't high, this is a usability issue that comes from actual problems. Right, so we're talking about scale. We want to have the protocol grow. And the question is, can we go to the size of Visa? That would be a good thing to have. Of course, we want to have higher rates if we can. We've already discussed some solutions to do this off-chain. I'm going to touch upon these as well. But really, we also want to have good on-chain scalability. We want to have as many resources as we can squeeze into this system and still be able to run it. So let's start with maybe some good news. So it turns out that the average transaction size in Bitcoin, at least, when you're not doing anything fancy, you're just signing, you're just moving money and signing stuff, is around 0.5 kilobyte. Like basically, if you have 2 transaction inputs and 2 outputs, that's roughly the size. And if you wanted to do Visa's scale, something like 2,000 transactions per second, what you're talking about in terms of data, just data that you should be following, is a megabyte per second. Okay, so think about this in terms of bandwidth. You have a node connected to the internet. You want to follow the blockchain. The amount of bandwidth you need is 1 megabyte per second. So I think of this as good news because this is a planet scale or almost a planet scale system that does a lot. Visa in 2010 is not a small system, and this is an internet connection that I have at home, right? I have 1 megabyte per second. So arguably, you can always ask, do I need to follow the entire blockchain? Can I shard it? We can ask all these questions, but this isn't too bad. I mean, this 1/2 kilobyte sounds like a pretty good deal to me, anyway. And Bitcoin's not here. To get to 2,000 transactions per second, we're going to need a lot of adoption. It's going to take years to get there. So, of course, 1 megabyte per second is not everything that you'll need. You'll need more. You're going to have to actually get it. You need to propagate messages to other nodes. You need a lot more communication. But this is an order of magnitude, back of the envelope calculation. Yeah.
Why do you kind of wave away the fact that you need to communicate to others?
So most of the communication is the block distribution, and you might just take a factor of 2 on this. I mean, everybody, right, on average, gets the block from someone and maybe sends it to someone else. So that's like a factor of 2, roughly, right? So you can take a factor of 3. So I'm not being precise here, right? This is already not a precise number, and this is made up, but yeah, so don't take me too seriously. So I did write here, right? This is the asterisk. This is a fine print. There's more communication that you need. And we'll get more precise about this. I'll actually say exactly what's being communicated in the protocol and how it's being saved. And actually, you also, if you think about it, there's ways in the protocol currently. First, when you have a node on the blockchain, right, listening to the blockchain, you're hearing all transactions because these get sent everywhere. And then you get the same transactions again in blocks that are sent to you when they're in the blockchain. So you hear transactions twice if you're connected to the blockchain with the naive implementation. And this actually is what Bitcoin was a while ago. Now it's somewhat better, and we'll get to that. Right, so here comes in a great question, right? If we're going to increase the block size, or we're going to have more blocks per second, maybe, there's obviously going to be more cost to running a node, right? You're going to need more bandwidth. You're going to need to store everything, right? You have to validate signatures on all the transactions coming in, so that's CPU. And some of the cost is really that it's harder to bootstrap. If you boot up a new node and you want to get all of the blockchain from the start, if the blockchain is really large, it takes a while. You can look at Ethereum's blockchain, for example, that exceeded 1 terabyte. I think it's around 1.2 or something, 1.2 terabytes. And it takes a few weeks to actually run through the whole thing and execute all the scripts and get to the current state. And then you need to follow the blockchain. Okay, so those are higher costs. And I think most of the maybe the largest question here is, what is the system that we imagine, what is the minimal system that should be able to keep up with the blockchain? Right? We don't expect everybody to be holding a cell phone that has all the blockchain on it. We don't need that. That's a bit extreme. That follows the entire thing and propagates blocks and does all these things. So some people say, and this is a real debate that I have with people in some of the core developers are telling me, we want a Raspberry Pi to be able to run everything. So I ask them, why a Raspberry Pi? I mean, we have miners that are huge. We have maybe 5 miners. Obviously, they need to validate. I'm not worried about them. They can store the entire blockchain, even at 2,000 transactions per second. If you think about it, a megabyte per second over a year ends up being maybe you add a terabyte or 2 every year of data. That's not a lot. I mean, you just buy an extra hard drive every year. If you're a miner and you're wasting Sweden's electricity amount, right? You can afford another hard drive, right? You can even afford 1,000 of them if you really wanted. And you're serving a system that's running something on the global economic scale. So these guys are okay. So now the question is, how far do we want to go down? I mean, should everybody be able to run a node from home? And of course, the extremists will say, yes, you have to be able to run. Bitcoin has to be democratized. Validation by every person on the planet, or the potential to validate is important. So there's one more thing to discuss when we're talking about scalability, and this is maybe about the incentives of people who are sending transactions and are doing things on the blockchain. There's a fundamental problem with the way Bitcoin fees are currently structured. If you think about it, when I send a transaction, I pay some small fee, but there's something that economists call an externality. An externality is when my action affects the utility of other people. So when I send something on the blockchain, basically every node right in the world now has to store this potentially forever. Right? I just wrote something, I paid a small fee. Now everybody has to keep this around if they want to be able to validate the blockchain from the beginning. So I'm not really paying for storage on everybody's machine, right, around the world for perpetuity, right? That's not there. So that's an externality. Another thing that happens every time I send a transaction, everybody has to broadcast it to everybody else. So I'm paying for bandwidth, and my price does not go up if you add more nodes to the network, but the cost to the network does go up. I mean, the more nodes are following the blockchain, more resources I'm claiming every time I transmit a transaction, but the price doesn't go up with the number of nodes. It goes up in terms of how much space do I pay for in the block, which does not necessarily have to be high. So there is the question of what happens if you do a denial of service attack on Bitcoin. You can try to put in a lot of transactions that you know are not going to end up in the blockchain. Maybe you pay very low fees. There's some defense mechanisms against denial of service, getting everybody to propagate your transactions, and then they don't get into the blockchain, so that you don't even pay the fees if they don't get in. So there's a mechanism for that, which roughly works. There are a lot of strange rules about transactions that we talked about. So something called replace by fee. If I see a transaction going to the same destinations, just adding more fees, I should replace it for the old one that's kind of stuck. The child pays for parent. All these ideas come up in the Bitcoin community to try to get transactions through. We have an issue that, right, there's another cost that everybody bears every time I send a transaction. That's the validation cost. Right? Everybody is supposed to check the signatures and check the transaction, but it turns out that in some instances, miners and maybe even other users kind of shirk these validation costs. They don't do them. So the idea here is that since everybody else around me validated a transaction and they send it to me, now I can probably say it's okay. It's probably safe. It's probably validated. It's probably valid. I kind of enjoy this herd immunity, and I don't have to validate myself. So this actually led to miners mining on top of blocks that were unvalidated. We had an incident with this in Bitcoin. There was a fork in the blockchain when a miner actually mined and published an invalid block that came from an older version of the code. And some other miners that have the newer version of the code should have validated and said, no, this is not a proper block. But actually, they were mining on top of that without validation. So this is called SPV mining. That caused a fork in the chain that I think it was something like 5 or 6 blocks deep. And eventually it was resolved, but this shouldn't happen. Right? This just was evidence of people doing something called SPV mining or spy mining. So in some sense, you trust others to have been validating. That's not always true. Another concern that also relates to these incentives is dust transactions. At some point in the history of Bitcoin, there was a service called Satoshi Dice. It was basically a gambling service. You could send money to Satoshi Dice. they would either send you a reward which doubles your money or triples your money. You could choose exactly what the factor would be, or if you lost some random roll of the dice, they send you nothing, and they could actually provably show you that you either won or lost. At the end of the day, they would release a seed for the random number generator that actually allowed you to verify that they didn't cheat. But the end result was that people were doing all these transactions back and forth, gambling on the blockchain, and spamming it with a lot of small transactions that were either just their reward. They were putting in a quarter, getting one back, putting two back, and so on, like a slot machine in a casino, but on the blockchain. So now we are in the world where this is kept forever, and people are kind of upset. Some of these transactions that Satoshi Das were sending were even really, really small. If you lost, your money wasn't taken away completely and gone. They sent you a transaction with a very small amount of money back. So this is something called, that now people call a dust transaction. Dust transactions are such transactions that maybe the money that you have in some output is so small that it's even smaller than the fees it would take to spend that output, right? So you have some output that's so small you couldn't even spend it. So there's a lot of money trapped in the blockchain in these forms of outputs that you couldn't actually spend if you paid the fees, because it just isn't worth it. You get, let's say, 1 Satoshi, but the fees would be 10 Satoshis to get that out. One of the ideas that people are kind of playing with are, should transactions pay rent on the blockchain? Should they be charged for the storage that they're right, for the space that they're occupying over all the nodes? And if they fail to pay their rent, there's a way to evict them, to actually erase them and put them in maybe in a Merkle tree somewhere, so we don't completely forget them, but they're not occupying as much space as before. So you take them basically from the current state, from the UTXO set, because they are sitting there. UTXO set is very expensive, sometimes even sits in memory. Ethereum is talking about this and evicting them to some other place, and if you want to restore them, you actually have to pay. It takes more money to validate the fact that you have a Merkle branch, get it back into the UTXO set so you can spend it. So that's an interesting idea. From the blockchain, it's possible to also maybe erase them retrospectively, but it's going to be harder, because how do you validate the chain all the way up until today without seeing this data? Right? It could be done as well, but it's a bit harder. So we're not paying for all these things. This is a question of incentives. So right. So maybe one more thing to talk about. Right. We've mentioned this a couple of times in passing. The block structure. Right. Transactions in Bitcoin blocks actually don't appear just as they are. There's really a data structure called the Merkle tree, which is just taking a bunch of transactions and hashing them together, taking a pair of other transactions, hashing together, and hashing these together, and so on, to build a tree. And right, the root of this Merkle tree is a commitment to all of the transactions. Right. So this is something that if you don't know about the Bitcoin block, this is the structure. Right. And what really happens, the block itself is made up of two parts. One is the block header, where you have the root for the entire tree of transactions. And then there's the block body that really does spell out all the transactions. Here, transaction 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. It's a bit more complicated with SegWit. Some of these transactions are broken up into two pieces and split apart, but this is the basic idea. And now this structure actually allows us to do clever things in Bitcoin, right? Right. So the thing that you actually hash to see if you get a low number or a large number of zeros here is really just the block header. It's an 80-byte piece that commits to the entire transaction set. It would be very expensive to actually run a hash function over a 1 megabyte block. On an 80-byte header, it's much more reasonable. And the thing that this structure really allows is it allows us to build light nodes, right? So this appears in Satoshi's original paper. You can give a proof that some transaction exists in this block by saying, you know, here's the block header, here's the Merkle root. Now what I can give you is just a path. Here's my transaction. If you hash it with something, and you hash it with another value, and hash that with another value, you get the root. And I couldn't lie about this, because if I tell you a transaction that isn't really in the root, that means I would have had to find a hash collision somewhere, which is supposed to be really hard, right? So these are collision-resistant hash functions. So this allows us to efficiently write in logarithmic communication and time, prove to somebody who has the root that a certain transaction is in there. And this basically allows us to build a light node, right? Somebody can just run now a wallet on your cell phone. Instead of having the entire blockchain, you are only collecting the headers of blocks, right? So, I'm sorry. So you're only collecting these 80-byte headers that are coming out every 10 minutes. You have the Merkle roots. You remember a Merkle path to your payment, right? And so now you can show everybody who wants to see that you have money. You can prove it to them. You can prove, write a full node, can prove it to the wallet. The wallet can display this for the person, and you can run a light node that is trustless in the sense that every time somebody tells it you got paid, they can actually prove this fact. So I'm pretty sure everybody here has seen these ideas. Yeah.
So if I have a wallet app on my phone, that's what it does, or?
Yeah. So a wallet app, really, what it does is it communicates with another server that's connected to the blockchain. It runs a full node, and it actually says, here's my address. Please let me know when I get paid. Right? It doesn't give the address exactly. It gives a Bloom filter. Like every address that passes this Bloom filter, please send it to me with a Merkle path. And it also asks the server to show it the headers of the blockchain. So what you can do with the headers is you can validate all of the proof of work, because the proof of work is done only on the blockchain headers. You see that it's hard to create the headers themselves. So you're now convinced that this is the blockchain if you ask a few of these servers, right, independently. And each one of them just needs to send you this path to your transaction proving that it's there. You have this money. You've received this money. That's a way to prove to your wallet that it's on the blockchain. Yeah. So if you don't know the difficulty, but if you ask around, you take the highest difficulty blockchain as the correct one. Right? That's Satoshi's idea of providing a simplified protocol verification. SPV stands for simplified or short protocol verification. There are different ways to instantiate the acronym. So there's another thing that you can't do currently. Right? Let's say somebody tells me, here's money in your account. How do I know it's not already spent? How do I know later, in some later block, there isn't a transaction that spends that output already? Right? So proving that you don't have a transaction in future blocks, something that you can't do with a Merkle path this way. It's harder. So there was a suggestion that I think is very nice and wasn't implemented yet, to include a Merkle root of unspent transactions in the header. So basically, not just commit to the transactions that are in the block, but also just list all the outputs that are still there to be spent, all the money that still hasn't moved, or all the open accounts. And I can show you that by giving you a path from this Merkle root to the UTXO that you own, that you still have the money in your account, right, in some sense. Sorry? It's not very expensive. You build a hash tree and you update it. You can think of clever ways to build it. So it's not done possibly because it is very expensive. It takes more time to construct a block if you have to do this. But this is an idea that was floating around.
But how do you know that somebody didn't commit immediately after?
That somebody didn't
Spend your money immediately.
So what you do is with this is you look at a place that's close to the tip of the blockchain. So maybe an hour ago or something like that. So that block is already somewhat final. There's a little bit of proof of work on it. And you know that an hour ago I did have the money, right? So that's the best thing you can do. You can't do it for the tips because those might be replaced. I mean, that's already unreliable. So this is not perfect. And actually, you can also show that simplified, that SPV nodes are easier to double spend against. There's a way to actually show that even with this Merkle root, they're not as secure as full nodes. I can show double spend attacks that work on SPV wallets that don't work on full nodes for some reason. But I won't get into that. Yeah?
Don't you get into that you have a second consensus problem now with the UTXO set? Because either everybody has the same organized UTXO set, or you have to communicate yours every time you send the block.
No, so you basically, the UTXO set can be constructed from the blockchain up until this point. So you just make it a consensus rule, a validity rule for the block. If the UTXO set here is not the one that is derived from the history up until this point, this block is illegal and other miners should reject it. So having seen that other miners build on top of that means that this is somewhat okay. At least some miners have said it. And that gives you some level of validity for an argument that you actually hold money or somebody else holds money.
And do these rules, because for this you would need strict rules on how to build such a tree.
Yes. Yes, they exist for the Merkle root itself. They exist for this. There are other ways of. There are canonical ways of building a tree. Like you can say, let's sort the UTXO in alphabetically, and just build a tree just the naive way. It's probably not the optimal way to do this, but there are better ways. But you can think of canonical ways. So between SPV and keeping everything, there are also other things we could do. We could run a node that keeps only the last month of the blockchain data, right? And keeps the headers of everything else. So what good is a node like that? It still validates every transaction that comes in live. It has a UTXO set in memory, so it can check every payment if it's legal or not. It can check signatures and so on. The only thing, and it already validated up to that point, so we just dump everything that's too old in terms of data. Now, that means we don't have to pay the storage cost. But it also means that if somebody boots up and tells us, I want to see the blocks from 2 months ago, I haven't been online for 2 months, you're not able to serve them. You tell them, you have to trust me that I validated this thing, but I deleted the data. So I really see a lot of value in this, and this is actually something that Bitcoin currently allows you to do. If you want to run a node on your machine, you don't want to store the whole blockchain, you can just save a few blocks worth of data.
You still store the entire UTXO?
You store the entire UTXO, you need that to validate, and you store all the block headers to the beginning of time, which is just 80 bytes out of this 1 megabyte, right? So not a big deal. Okay, so I think this should answer people's problems with bandwidth and storage. So now I really want to get to the deeper problems with the protocol, not just storage, because I think the storage problem is not really a big deal. And the bigger problem is something that comes out of the assumptions that we have underlying the protocol. So we had these two assumptions in the protocol that nodes can communicate quickly and attackers control under 50% of the compute power. But this assumption is broken, really, if you start to have larger blocks. Right? This was one of our assumptions for the security of analysis in Bitcoin. And I want to talk specifically about how this is violated. Right? In general, any time the Bitcoin protocol gets into trouble, you can trace it back, in my opinion, to some assumption in this basic theorem. Like, for example, we're going to talk about attacks on the infrastructure that disconnect people from the network. This also breaks that assumption. And there are things like selfish mining attacks are really an attack on this assumption, this assumption that the attacker has less than 50% of the compute power. We don't really know if the attacker has it or not. So we try to incentivize a lot of nodes to join the protocol. And a selfish mining attack basically hurts these incentives. So every time somebody says the Bitcoin protocol doesn't work or doesn't work well, usually you're talking about one of these assumptions. So what happens when you have larger blocks and you try to propagate them? So this is data by Christian Decker and Roger Wattenhofer. Christian was doing a PhD in ETH at the time, and they were measuring Bitcoin. Bitcoin was producing blocks of different sizes because of the availability of transactions at the moment, and they were just checking how long it took the block to arrive at different destinations in the network. So it's pretty obvious, but it still is nice to show it, that when you have larger blocks, it takes longer to transmit them. So this red line here is the amount of time it took to transmit a block to 25% of the nodes. So 300 kilobyte blocks took longer than 150, and so on. This is linear if you think about it in the block size, because if you have a certain amount of bandwidth and you want to send something larger, it just takes more time, right? It's approximate, right? There's also a gap here, like a zero size block doesn't take zero time because there are propagation delays. You're running over several hops. You have to have validation running here in between of the proof of work and so on. But let's say this is roughly just a linear model of propagation time. So now what's going to happen when we want more transactions per second? Naively, we have two ways of getting to that goal. We can either have larger blocks, which will take longer to propagate, or we can have higher block creation rates. Instead of a block every 10 minutes, let's have a block every 5 minutes. Let's have a block every minute. Let's have a block every second. Why not? A megabyte block every second would be great. We'll have a lot of bandwidth in the protocol. So the problem is that the time to distribute blocks in both of these cases is no longer negligible compared to the block creation rate. Right? So if I create a block every second, I'm not able to send my block to all the nodes before the next one is created. Or if my block is large, like if it's a gigabyte block, I'm not able to send it to everybody before the next block is created. So the result of this is going to be more forks in the blockchain. Really, it's not a chain, it's a tree, right? Every block points to a predecessor. And that's going to lead to lower security in the protocol. So the basic idea is more transactions per second, protocol security collapses. Okay, and I'm going to show you exactly why and how. So one more point, you may have seen this table in the past. This is the number of confirmations or the number of blocks you need to wait to get some assurance that transactions aren't reversed when you're facing an attacker that gets, that has this percentage of the mining power. And Bitcoin always tells people to wait around 6 confirmations. If you're faced with very small attackers, 2% attackers or so on, that's great. These numbers get progressively worse. But this analysis that's done, this table, really doesn't talk about the interval between blocks. If we had a block every second, and we assume instant propagation of blocks, we are still in this world where 6 confirmations should have given us, by the analysis, the same percentages, right? If block transmission was instantaneous. So cutting down, right, increasing the block rate would actually mean that we can confirm transactions much faster. We get to this result based on number of blocks. Time doesn't figure into here. So we have to somehow think about how time should have affected this table and our security, right? And this is what I really want to talk about. Yeah, there were some questions. So I took from a paper of mine with Jonathan Sompolinsky. We redid the analysis that Satoshi did, that Manny Rosenfeld later did. So this is, as far as I know, the kind of the tightest result. We're doing a lot of thinking about a random walk that happens between the attacker and the defender. And we're also figuring things up with kind of pre-mining. If the attacker starts an attack early before he does the double spends, before he transmits it. So we have a whole paper about exactly how to understand Satoshi's result. We think it was kind of interpreted in a not exactly clear way, and we've tried to sort that out. So if you want, I can later give you the paper, a link to it. Any more questions? You had one, maybe? Okay. So you can find like a very simple analysis of this in Manny Rosenfeld's paper. But many also didn't get everything right. So he has different numbers than we do. But not something drastically different. So here's the idea of what happens when you start increasing either the block size or the block rate. You get a block graph that looks like this. You're starting to create a lot of blocks in parallel, because when this was created, you didn't manage to send it to all nodes, and this was trying to extend, a preceding block. These are created roughly at the same time. They didn't propagate fast enough in the network. So you're getting this tree instead of a nice long chain that the analysis originally had us do. So when you propagate just the header, the other miners can't create another block because they're not allowed to put in transactions that are double spends. They really need to know what's in here before they can create this, because maybe you already spent an output and now somebody here tries to include an output that's not theirs. They'll fail at creating the block. The block will be invalid.
Still, it should stop working on the current block.
Yes. So what they currently do, this SPV mining is exactly because of that. They somehow learn about the block header first. So effectively, they try to often create an empty block on top of that. That at least guarantees them the block reward. And they end up extending blocks that might be invalid. They never validated. So if you look at the Bitcoin blockchain, when blocks are created too close to each other, like 1 second after the previous one was received, the miners sometimes will create an empty block. Even though the mempool is full, you could have populated it. And it leaves money aside, supposedly, right? It's a very curious thing. Why would you create an empty block when you could be collecting fees? The answer is because you're trying to optimize. You understand now that your old block is no longer relevant. You still try to collect some money until you manage to get the block and validate you're working on an empty one. So these are all sorts of weird optimizations that come into the Bitcoin protocol. And we learn about them when accidents happen and when we see weird things happening in the blockchain. So miners are doing very clever things in that respect. So now when we have a tree like this, so first of all, I want you to notice is that the longest chain is not as long as the number of blocks that were created. There are blocks that are off the chain here. So there's proof of work that's really not extending the length of the chain. It's wasted in terms of security, right? So when an attacker shows up, it doesn't need to beat all of the blocks in the blockchain. It just needs to defeat the longest chain, which is not as long as it would have been if communications were faster. So that's the basic idea. Double spend attacks become much easier. And the more this tree is kind of wide, and right, then the attacker's job is easier. So I want to give you a very simple model of this. Let's see if we have time. We have 10 minutes. So I'm going to just do a back of the envelope calculation just to show you what Bitcoin could do and where we're going. So think of many small miners. And the model really is that miners are so small that it's really unlikely that a given miner will be creating 2 blocks in a row. So think of miners that are 1/1,000,000%, right? So this obviously is not the case for Bitcoin really. But I'm just going to assume this because it's easier to analyze. And let's assume that when a miner creates a block, he immediately sends it to everybody. And the block arrives simultaneously at all other nodes. And it takes exactly d seconds to do this. Okay, so this is, I can actually show the way this is a lower bound on some block creation rate. And what we're going to be interested in is how fast does the blockchain grow in these circumstances when we set d to other things in the block creation rate. So first of all, what I want you to understand that is that if one miner creates the block at height 1,000, for example, and starts to send it, and another miner then creates the block of size 1,000, what happens? Which one would win? The one that was first, right? So while we have these d seconds taking place, every miner that now finds a block is basically wasting it. So there's effectively nothing increasing the length of the blockchain. All the blocks that are created during these d seconds do not contribute to the length of the blockchain. And here I'm using this assumption that none of these miners creates 2 blocks in a row, right? But assume they're really small, so this is really negligible. So we have, in some sense, when the chain was just extended, d seconds in which it probably won't grow. in length. So what's our expected time between blocks then? It's these seconds that we're waiting while this block propagates. And we have some block creation rate that I'll denote at lambda. And the expected time between blocks is actually 1 over lambda. Blocks are created in a sort of a Poisson process with inter-arrival times that are exponentially distributed. And if you have an exponential distribution, right, with rate lambda, you're actually waiting 1 over lambda in expectation. So in Bitcoin, lambda would be 1 over 600 seconds, 1 block every 600 seconds. And 1 over lambda is you expect to wait 600 seconds. So now, what is the rate of growth of this blockchain in this scenario? It's just, right, 1 over, right, if you do a back of the envelope calculation, which actually can be formalized to be exact, the rate of growth of the chain, which is beta, what I mark here as beta, is 1 over d plus 1 over lambda. Okay, so that's fairly simple because this is the amount of time we wait between blocks. So this is the rate of growth of blocks. If you look at a long interval of time, you expect to see this average rate of blocks on the main chain, on the longest chain. So now you can plug in your favorite numbers into this formula. You can say something like, here's a completely made up number, so don't take me up on that. Let's say it takes me 10 seconds to deliver 1 megabyte to everyone. And I'm assuming that if I have to deliver 2 megabytes, it's going to take me 20 seconds, and 3 megabytes are going to take me 30 seconds, because I'm assuming this linear model that we saw in the data. And now what we get, we can plug it into the formula, right? So D, our delay that appeared here, is now maybe a 30 megabyte block times 10 seconds that it takes to deliver a megabyte. So this number is 300 plus 1 over the rate of creation of blocks in the network. And that gives us the rate of growth of the longest chain. Okay, now in the Bitcoin protocol, right, the longest chain, the rate of growth of the longest chain is the thing that we are adjusting the difficulty for. Right? We are fixing this number. We're not fixing the rate that blocks are created. We're fixing the length of the rate at which the longest chain grows. If the longest chain after 2 weeks did not grow fast enough, the difficulty is changed. Difficulty of block creation is changed to accommodate for that. So this is 1 every 10 minutes, this beta. And that gives us, right, we can solve this equation and see what is the rate of block creation that really takes place. And some of these just fall off. They don't get into the main chain. So we end up in this scenario that I completely made up, creating 1 block every 300 seconds, every 5 minutes. And so our rate of growth of the main chain is half of half of the blocks that we create end up being on the longest chain. So that means if half of our blocks end up being on the longest chain, you can think about it for a second, it means that we're susceptible not to a 50% attack, but in this case to a 34% attack. Okay, so that means a miner that has 34% of the network facing the rest of the network that has 66%, they're using all their 66%, but half of their blocks are falling off. So really, they're using only 33% mining power in some sense to add to the longest chain, and he has more than them. Right? So he builds blocks faster than what the chain grows. So this is still nice, right? Because 30 megabyte blocks, if you think about them with the numbers I gave before, would give you 100 transactions per second. And instead of a 50% attack, we went down to a 34% attack. Maybe we're okay with this. So that doesn't seem too bad. Okay, I mean, you lose some security, but so what? You get to PayPal scale with this. So you have to, of course, believe these numbers that it takes 10 seconds to deliver a megabyte, etc. So I have 3 minutes. So I really want to show you, maybe I'll skip to the real problem. This model actually fails, by the way. If you try to plug in a number like 60 megabyte blocks, you'll see that you need 1 over lambda to be, the block creation rate to be infinite. And you can think about why. But so I really want to get maybe to one of the main problems that does really affect Bitcoin's scalability. And it's not the decreased decreased security. So we can tolerate some decrease in security, for example, to 33% attacks. We could probably live with that. The real thing that people are bothered about, if you ask the core developers, what is the thing that makes you not want to increase block size from 1 megabyte to 2 megabyte, they'll say it's this. It's the skewed rewards. So there's this idea that larger miners start to make more money than smaller miners. So obviously they make more money just by being larger because they create more of the blocks. Like if you're a 20% miner, you expect to make 20% of the blocks and so 20% of the rewards. But the effect I'm talking about is a 20% miner actually making 22% of the rewards, or more than his fair share of the block rewards. And the way to think about this is, I want you to imagine two miners in the network. One is large and one is small. And let's suppose both of them just created a block at the same time, the same instant. And let's say they're both equally connected. So when one of them sends a block to another miner, the other also does the same to a different miner of the same size, and so on. So distribution of blocks is exactly the same. But one of their blocks, right, they've both created the block at exactly the same time. One of these is going to get abandoned, thrown off the main chain. One of them is going to get adopted. Which one is more likely to be the one that survives in the main chain? The 20%. Why is that? Because even before he started sending his block out, he's trying to extend his own block, right? Just himself. So when he himself is trying to extend his own block, there's a 20% chance that he's going to build another one. And for the 5% miner, there's only a 5% chance that he's going to extend his own block. Okay, so this is maybe a first order effect. This guy who's larger, just by being larger, in the world where we delay block propagation, he already started work on the next block, and he's larger. So he has like a boost in distribution because he distributes to himself in some sense. Now there's a second order effect. Let's suppose I'm one of these small miners and I just created a block. Who should I send it to first? Who should I really work hard to get it to? To the 5% miner or to the 20% miner? Probably to the 20% miner. Why? Because I'm always worried that somebody else is going to create a block at the same time and mine is going to be invalidated. So the best idea is to get it to the person with the most mining power out there as fast as I can so they can extend my block and put it into the chain. So it turns out that everybody really, really wants to connect to the largest miner. You really want to be connected to them. They get all the blocks first. They distribute their blocks fastest. Right? If you want to listen to the blockchain, who's going to have the most up-to-date version? Probably the larger miner, because he's most likely to have built the latest block as well. So they get a boost just because of being large. Everybody wants to connect to them. Everyone wants to listen to them. And they already have a natural advantage in creating blocks. And this is all an effect of delay in the network. The fact that broadcasting is not instantaneous. Right? So this is an effect of that gets amplified at scale. So the reward distribution is going to be more skewed. Larger miners are going to make more and more and more of the money. So there are a bunch of solutions to all these problems. I'm going to steal maybe 5 minutes of your time. Maybe one of the first things that we should talk about is that people have been working a lot on propagating blocks faster. You know, after some of these works came out by Christian Decker, Roger Wattenhofer, we did some stuff in our Ghost paper. People started really paying attention to propagating blocks. So Decker and Wattenhofer suggested something called pipelining, which is basically start to propagate the block header. Once you validate the block header, you see that the proof of work is there. You immediately start transmitting the block to the next guy. You don't have to validate the whole block. You start to get, like you got the first byte of the block. You don't wait till you receive the whole block. You start to forward it. You'll do the validation later. You already know that the proof of work is correct by just reading this 80 bytes. So nobody's going to do a denial of service attack on you. On the other hand, you already are starting to send the block onwards. Instead of receiving everything, validating, and then starting transmission again. So this is something that they suggested. This actually comes into play with Goon's protocol on Bitcoin NG. You could think of Bitcoin NG as some sort of a pipelining scheme if you really wanted. There's also this idea when you're sending blocks, you're actually not just requesting the block from everybody. You get inventory messages from your neighbors saying, I have a new block, I have a new block. Then you send them a request, a get data request for the block, and they answer. Just one of these guys answers with the block. So all of that delays block propagation, waiting for this inventory, get data, and block. So if you have a really high bandwidth and blocks are relatively small, you could just send the block anyway. All of these guys just send the block instead of just communicating. That costs you more bandwidth, but if the block is small, maybe that's worth it. There's infrastructure that's out there. There are block relay networks. Emin is working on a commercial one, but there are ones that miners are currently connected to. There's infrastructure that's designed to connect miners to each other to propagate blocks quickly. They skip validation. They do pipelining. They do all the tricks that they can to get the blocks out as quickly as possible to nodes. And really, if you look at block propagation delays in Bitcoin currently, 1 megabyte block is propagated within less than a second to everybody in the network. So those 10-second numbers that I gave you there are not completely bogus. Actually, 1 megabyte is transmitted sometimes within like a single packet or two over these super efficient relay networks. But they're just really designed to connect on all the 5 miners in the world. So it's not that big a deal. And maybe another interesting proposal is thin blocks and compact blocks, which kind of says we already propagated the transactions to everybody. They have a mempool that's almost exactly the same at every node. So now when I want to tell you what the new block is, I just need to tell you which subset of the mempool it is. Maybe since you can already guess most of it, right? You know that I'm going to pick from the top of the mempool. I need to give you like a very small set difference from what you guess and what the block actually is. And there are data structures that do this efficiently, and there are ways to do it. So you actually, when you're sending a block, you're already relying on the transaction having been sent earlier, and you can send something smaller than a megabyte. And this is something that is also done by this infrastructure. Okay, we are out of time. So we've, of course, mentioned the Lightning Network. I'm not going to touch upon it, but so one solution is to take everything off the chain. You're going to have more transactions per second. This is the picture of the actual Lightning Network right now. Lightning has some issues. We're going to talk about zero-knowledge proofs and how they help scalability. That's going to be tomorrow. I'm just going to mention it briefly, but there's an idea. We talked about sharding, a little bit about sharding. This is an open question exactly because of this scalability debate. If you are not forced to look at the entire blockchain, you don't have to store it, and more importantly, you don't have to propagate really, really large blocks, you're going to get orders of magnitude of improvement. Okay, so I'll let you all have a coffee break now. I'm sure you're tired and thirsty. And we'll talk about advanced protocols next hour. Thank you, guys.